A contractor once told me he got hit with a $12,000 workers' audit bill at the end of the year, and he had no idea why. In his mind, it made no sense because the people he paid weren't employees. They were 1099 contractors. But here's the trap most business owners don't realize. Just because you pay someone as a 1099 does not mean your workers' insurance company sees it that way. And if that contractor doesn't carry their own workers' coverage, you might be paying for it anyway. In this video, I'll show you why paying someone as a 1099 doesn't automatically protect you from workers' compensation costs, how insurance companies decide when subcontractor payments get charged to your policy during an audit, and the one simple thing you must collect before paying a contractor so you don't get stuck with a massive surprise bill at the end of the year. To understand why this keeps happening to business owners, you have to think about workers' comp from the insurance company's perspective. Imagine someone gets seriously hurt on a job site. Hospital bills start piling up, lost wages need to be paid, rehabilitation could last months. Now ask yourself one simple question: who pays for that? Workers' compensation systems are designed so that someone is always financially responsible when a worker gets injured. So, if the person who gets hurt doesn't have their own workers' comp insurance, the system usually pushes that responsibility upstream to the business that hired them. And that's where a lot of businesses get blindsided. Let me tell you about the contractor who called me about that $12,000 audit bill. He was genuinely confused. He said, "I don't understand how this happened. None of those guys are employees. They're 1099 subcontractors." And from his perspective, that sounded perfectly logical. When he would get a new job, sometimes he needs extra help finishing the work. So he'd call a few guys he knew, bring them on the job for a couple days, pay them as 1099s, and move on to the next project. Pretty standard for construction. But as we kept talking, the real problems started to show up. I asked him a simple question: did those subcontractors have their own workers' comp insurance? And he said something I hear all the time: "Well, I'm not sure. Sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't." And most of the time, he never collected proof of it before paying them. So when the workers' comp audit came around at the end of the year, the insurance company asked for something very specific: certificate of workers' compensation insurance for those subcontractors. And the problem was he didn't have them. Some of those guys had already moved on to other jobs. Some of them had stopped answering the phone. Some of them he couldn't track down at all. So, from the insurance company's perspective, the situation was very simple. If a subcontractor cannot prove they had their own workers' comp policy, the insurance company often treats that payment the same as employee payroll, which means those subcontractor payments suddenly got added to the payroll exposure on the policy. And that's exactly how he ended up with a $12,000 surprise audit. Now, the story we just talked about isn't unusual. In fact, it happens all the time because most business owners don't know the rule workers' comp auditors follow. And the rule is actually very simple. If a subcontractor cannot prove they had workers' comp insurance during the policy period, their payments can be charged to your policy during the audit. Notice what's missing from that rule. There's nothing in there about whether the worker was paid as a 1099 or a W-2. Workers' comp audits aren't trying to figure out your tax classification. They're trying to figure out who could be responsible if someone gets hurt while doing the work. Think about it from the insurance company's perspective. The worker was on your project, they were doing your work, and if they get injured on that job site, there's a real chance they could pursue benefits through the business that hired them. So the auditor asks for one thing that proves the risk belongs somewhere else: a certificate of workers' compensation insurance. And if you can show that certificate, the auditor can verify that the subcontractor carried their own policy. And once that's confirmed, their payroll does not get added to your policy. But if you can't produce that certificate during the audit, the insurance company often assumes the exposure belongs to you. And that's when those subcontractor payments get reclassified as payroll and added into the premium calculation. This situation shows up constantly in construction because of how projects actually run in the real world. A job gets busy, a deadline starts creeping up. You realize you need a couple extra hands to get the work done. So you call someone you know. Maybe it's a guy you've worked with before. Maybe it's someone another contractor recommended. They show up, help finish the job. You pay them as a 1099, and everyone moves on. From the business owner's perspective, that's just how the industry works. But there's one step that often gets skipped in the rush to finish the project: No one stops to collect the proof of workers' comp before the work starts. And that's where the trouble begins. Because by the time the workers' comp audit shows up months later, those subcontractors are usually long gone. They're on different jobs, they've changed phone numbers, sometimes they're impossible to track down. And without that certificate of workers' comp insurance, the auditor has no way to confirm that the exposure belongs somewhere else. So that so the payments end up getting treated like payroll, which means the contractor who thought they were just paying a 1099 suddenly finds out they've been paying workers' comp premium on that labor all along. The problem isn't limited to construction either. I saw the exact same thing happen with a home health agency. Now, in that industry, it's very common for caregivers to want to work as independent contractors. They like the flexibility to work with multiple agencies, pick their schedules, and move between clients. So the agency paid a large portion of their caregivers as 1099 contractors. And just like the contractor we talked about earlier, the assumption was simple. If they're 1099, we don't have to worry about workers' comp. But there was one problem. The agency never collected proof that those caregivers carried their own workers' comp insurance. So when the workers' comp audit happened, the auditor asked for the same thing they'd always ask for: certificates of workers' compensation insurance. The agency didn't have them. And because those certificates didn't exist, the insurance company treated those contractor payments the same way they treat payroll exposure. Those caregiver payments were added to the policy. The final audit bill, more than $35,000. And the frustrating part is that the agency thought they were doing everything right simply by paying people as 1099 contractors. The good news is that this problem is actually very easy to prevent. There's really just one rule you need to follow whenever you hire a subcontractor. Before you pay them, collect a certificate of workers' compensation insurance showing they have their own policy. That document proves to your insurance company that the subcontractor carried their own coverage during the time they were working for you. And when the audit happens, that certificate becomes your proof that the exposure belongs to their policy and not yours. Two things matter when you collect that certificate. First, make sure it specifically shows workers' compensation coverage, not just general liability. And second, make sure the policy was active during the time they were working for you. If you had that certificate on file, the auditor can verify that the subcontractor had their own coverage, which means their payments do not get added to your workers' compensation payroll during the audit. But if you don't have it, the insurance company will often assume the responsibility falls back on the business who hired them. And that's how these surprise audit bills. So here's the easiest way to remember this rule. Paying someone as a 1099 contractor might satisfy the IRS, but the workers' comp is asking a completely different question. If this person gets hurt while working, who pays for the injury? If that worker has their own workers' comp policy, the answer is simple: the insurance pays. But if they don't have their own coverage, the system often assumes the responsibility rolls back to the business that hired them. And that's why so many companies get surprised during their workers' comp audit. They were thinking about tax classification, but the insurance company was thinking about injury liability exposure. Now, if you're watching this and thinking, okay, I understand the trap, but how do I actually control my workers' comp costs? I put together another video specifically for businesses here in Maryland where I walk through the practical ways contractors and business owners can lower their workers' comp premiums without cutting coverage or creating risk. Things like how insurance companies calculate your premium, what actually drives the cost up, and the strategies you can use to bring it down. So if you want to understand how to save money on Maryland workers' compensation insurance, click right here and watch that video next. Hit the link in the description to get started, or I'll see you in the next video.